Good evening. Tonight we will drift into the forgotten hush of an island far removed from the centers of the world, a place where time itself seemed to walk more slowly, and where weary warriors once sought to live in exile. The sea lay wide and endless, stretching like a darkened mirror beneath the fading colors of dusk. Along the horizon, where the last embers of day dissolved into the swelling night, a shadow of land rose, jagged, uneven, and partly obscured by veils of mist. This was the island, a solitary shape held within the shifting embrace of tides. The air around it bore the mingling fragrance of salt and kelp, edged by the sharp, almost metallic tang of stone that had been weathered by centuries of waves. Seabirds circled high above, their calls distant and faint, as if already softened by the stillness that seemed to emanate from the coast itself. The shoreline was rough and stony, not of soft sand but of dark pebbles and fractured rock. Long fingers of volcanic stone jutted into the sea, their edges gnawed by foam. At low tide, barnacles glistened like tiny jewels, and tide pools gathered, holding starfish, shell fragments, and the glimmer of trapped crabs. When the sun receded, shadows filled these pools, and the waters reflected pale smears of the sky. Each evening, as darkness settled, the island revealed its truer nature, an austerity of form and texture, stripped of frivolity, where survival clung to the simplest rhythms of tide, wind, and stone. Beyond the shore rose cliffs softened by moss and sparse grasses. Their ridges caught the breeze, which carried a continuous sigh, a voice that never ceased but changed in timbre with each season. Higher still, groves of bent pine trees clung to the rocky slopes, their roots twisted into unlikely shapes as they fought to anchor themselves in thin soil. The needles of these pines whispered like brushes on paper whenever the wind turned. Between the trees, wild grasses spread in muted colors, green in spring, fading into brown and silver as the months passed, always bowing slightly under the burden of salt carried from the sea. The island bore few flowers, and those that did bloom were modest. White blossoms trembling near the roots of trees, or faint violet petals hidden in shadowed gullies. Their fragrance was never strong. One had to bend low to catch even the suggestion of sweetness. More common were the lichens and mosses that clung stubbornly to stone, painting the cliffs in hues of faded green, yellow, and gray. These slow-growing lives became the quiet tapestries of the island, marking time not by hours or days, but by years and decades. At night, the atmosphere deepened into something heavier, as though the sea and land drew inward. The moon's reflection stretched upon the surface of the water, and the cries of birds fell away. Only the steady wash of waves upon the shore remained, ceaseless and unhurried. Fireflies appeared during the warmer months, their dim sparks wandering through the grasses, lending the air an ethereal movement. Each faint glow lingered only for a moment before vanishing, like the pulse of memory. The human presence upon the island was marked by structures both humble and enduring. Scattered across the lower slopes stood dwellings built of wood and stone. Their timbers were darkened by age, their roofs thatched with straw that had faded into dull gray. Some of the houses leaned slightly with the weight of storms endured, yet they held together, tied and reinforced with ropes of twisted fiber, patched again and again by careful hands. Wooden shutters rattled faintly in the wind, and narrow porches stood where sandals had worn grooves into the planks. The interiors were simple, governed by necessity. Tatami mats lay worn and patched, sometimes with pieces of rough cloth laid across to cover thinning sections. Small clay hearths bore the faint scent of ash even when unlit, for smoke had long settled into the fibers of the walls. Tools of survival were always near. Knives sharpened until their handles grew smooth, ropes coiled neatly, baskets woven from reeds, and small jars sealed with wax. Rice mortars, though often empty, stood in corners, their presence both practical and symbolic, reminders of rituals of preparation even when rice itself was scarce. Light within these homes came not from lamps of luxury but from modest oil vessels, their flames wavering gently, sending shadows across wooden beams. Smoke curled upward in delicate spirals, leaving faint stains above. The sound of crackling firewood was steady, slow, and often the only sound in the room, accompanied perhaps by the faint susurration of wind slipping through cracks. Clothing followed the same measure of restraint. The garments of the exiled men were not the splendid robes once worn at feasts or in the courts of lords. Instead, they wore robes of muted hues, browns, grays, and off-whites, stitched and restitched until the cloth bore the visible scars of long use. Fraying edges were tucked away, stains faded but never truly gone. Over time, these garments seemed to merge with the very landscape, blending with the bark of pines, the stone of cliffs, the washed-out tones of seaweed and sand. Yet within these figures, a certain posture remained, something that no exile, no hunger, no weather could erase. Their backs were often straight even when carrying burdens. Their movements, though slowed by age or fatigue, carried a restrained deliberateness, a memory of discipline. The gestures of tying a sash, the way hands lingered over the hilt of a worn sword, the ritual of bowing before a meal. These things persisted, softened but unbroken, echoes of a code that still resided within them. The island was both prison and sanctuary. For those who came here, it meant removal from the world they once knew, the clamor of cities, the layered rituals of courts, the bustle of markets, the endless call of duty to one's lord. In place of all that came the monotony of waves, the slow labor of gathering driftwood, the task of coaxing crops from reluctant soil. Yet, for some, the silence allowed the mind to dwell on other matters. Memory, regret, and the long contemplation of life's impermanence. Seasons rolled across the island with a clarity that could not be ignored. Spring was brief, a fragile interlude when new grasses emerged, and pale blossoms hinted at renewal. Summer brought heavy heat, pressing down upon the dwellings, filling the air with the sharp sense of pine resin and seaweed baking in the sun. Autumn came as relief, the sky broadening with cool winds, the leaves of hardy shrubs turning to muted amber and rust. Winter was the longest, the hardest. Storms that rattled the houses, winds that howled like restless spirits, seas that grew violent and forbidding. During those months, the people drew closer together, huddled around the fire, rationing food with solemn measure. Food was always at the edge of scarcity. Fish were caught with nets woven from reeds, or with lines and hooks fashioned from bone or bent metal. Shellfish gathered from the rocky tide pools supplemented meals. Small plots of land near the dwellings grew millet, barley, and hardy vegetables, but yields were meager. Each harvest brought a mixture of relief and disappointment. There was enough to continue, never enough to rest easy. In lean times, even tree bark was boiled. Its bitter taste endured in silence. Still, rituals persisted. Meals, no matter how sparse, were taken with quiet order. Bowls were set carefully, portions divided with fairness. Chopsticks were handled with respect, and before eating, each man bowed his head in acknowledgement of what the land and sea had provided. These gestures did not erase hunger, but they preserved dignity, and within dignity, a thread of meaning that sustained more than the body. Among the exiles were those whose hair had turned white, their brows lined deeply from years of sun and worry. Others were still young, though their youth bore little of the recklessness often seen in cities. Here, even the youngest carried themselves with a restraint beyond their years, tempered by the gravity of exile and the weight of survival. Silence was common, though not oppressive. Words were used sparingly, gestures and glances often sufficed. Swords remained, though dulled by time. Some had no scabbards, some had chipped blades. Yet they were cleaned, oiled, and preserved with a care bordering on reverence. Not because they would be used often. There were no battles here, no enemies to face, but because they were extensions of identity, of vows once made, of lives once lived in service. To let the blade rust completely would be to sever the final tie to the path that had defined them. Thus, each stroke of cloth upon steel was not simply maintenance but remembrance. On quiet evenings, when the sun sank and shadows stretched across the island, the men sometimes gathered beneath the pines. They would sit in silence, watching the sea as it shifted from silver to black, listening to the steady chorus of waves. The scent of resin and salt filled the air, and in those moments, the island seemed less a prison and more a threshold, a place between the world that had cast them away and the unknown that lay beyond. Time on the island did not rush. Days blended softly into one another, distinguished only by the angle of sunlight, the pattern of clouds, the shift of the wind. Even the storms, though fierce, became part of a rhythm. Life reduced itself to essentials, and in that reduction lay both hardship and a strange, enduring peace. The code of the samurai, though frayed by exile, lingered. Honor was not displayed in grand deeds, but in the quiet endurance of each day. In the measured way a bowl was lifted, in the uncomplaining acceptance of scarcity, in the refusal to surrender dignity to despair. Here, far from courts and lords, honor was distilled to its simplest form. How one faced the silence of time, the inevitability of decline, and the certainty of death. And so the island endured, and those who dwelt upon it endured as well, bound together not by choice but by circumstance, by the unyielding reality of survival, and by the faint but persistent flame of memory that each carried within. The night deepened, the sea continuing its endless cadence. Stars emerged, dim at first, then brighter, scattered across the black expanse. The island rested beneath them, solitary yet steadfast, holding its exiles in the slow embrace of silence. The forgotten samurai, once bound to the ceaseless duties of the world beyond, now became part of this rhythm, unseen, uncelebrated, but not entirely lost. Within the mist that often drifted across the island's slopes, figures moved quietly, their shapes softened by the damp veil that lingered after night. Sandals pressed into wet soil, leaving patterns that vanished with the rising breeze, while shoulders bore baskets, nets, and worn tools fashioned long ago. Each movement was careful, not with haste or expectation, but with the solemn persistence of men accustomed to survival without reward. Down at the shoreline, they worked among the rocks and pools left by the receding tide. Nets were cast into the gray water, their threads darkened by years of salt and repair, while patient hands pulled shellfish from crevices or pried limpets from stone. The smell of kelp drying on the rocks mingled with the cold fragrance of sea brine. Every detail of this labor bore the same character: deliberate, measured, and uncomplaining. Further inland, the narrow fields demanded equal attention. Cut into uneven slopes, they yielded grain and vegetables only through constant care. Men bent over them in silence, loosening the soil with rough wooden hoes, tying stalks upright, pulling weeds with practiced fingers. Sweat traced paths down faces hardened by years of wind and sun. Yet the work was carried on steadily, each motion pared down to its essential form. Their garments, patched and repatched, clung loosely around their frames, dyed in tones that mirrored the island itself: stone gray, bark brown, faded straw. Frayed edges were tucked beneath sashes, cloth tightened by hands that remembered once fastening armor, now fastening mere fabric for labor. These robes no longer suggested prestige but endurance, their quiet resilience echoing the lives of those who wore them. Meals, when prepared, reflected the same austerity. A portion of millet, a handful of greens, perhaps a fish brought from the tide. Bowls were arranged with care, chopsticks handled with the grace of custom, and silence held steady while each man acknowledged what had been provided. Hunger was rarely absent, yet dignity remained intact, preserved in the gestures of division, in the restraint of taking no more than one's share. On rare days, the island offered a kind of subdued beauty that softened even the sternness of exile. The pines, bent and twisted by endless winds, shimmered faintly in the sunlight, their needles whispering like paper brushed with ink. Above them, the sky widened into a pale blue expanse, streaked with the thin trails of migrating birds. Beneath this sky, the exiles sat in stillness, their eyes following the flight, their silence filled not with expectation but with recognition of distance, of lives they had left, of worlds now beyond reach. Evenings brought the same return to shadows, the same gathering of smoke into rafters, the same rhythm of waves against the rocks. Oil lamps cast pale circles of light upon wooden floors, illuminating hands at quiet tasks. Sharpening a blade that would never see battle, weaving rope from strands of fiber, patching garments by the slow rhythm of needle through cloth. These humble labors filled the hours between dusk and rest, grounding each day in necessity. And yet, even here, traces of the old path remained. The way one adjusted his posture while seated, the way another's fingers lingered on the hilt of a sword resting across his knees, the bow of the head before a simple meal. These were not merely habits but fragments of a code once binding, now surviving in gestures. In these small continuities, the men remained who they were, though their world had narrowed to this remote island. At times, when the air was still and the sea calm, memory itself seemed to breathe across the settlement. The silence carried with it an echo, distant drums, the clatter of armor, the solemn call of orders once given and obeyed. These recollections did not come with bitterness but with the subdued clarity of things long past, folded into the present like faint colors upon an old scroll. Thus the island shaped them, and they, in turn, gave the island their quiet endurance. Days merged into one another, unmarked by triumphs or defeats, defined instead by persistence, by the deliberate honoring of each small act of living, by the slow rhythm of time unspooling without interruption. The seasons carried their weight slowly across the island, each leaving its mark in ways both subtle and unmistakable. The spring was a brief guest, scarcely more than a promise before the winds turned warm. Pale blossoms appeared along the sparse shrubs, delicate against the dark stone, and for a short time the air held a fragrance faint enough to vanish at the touch of salt carried from the sea. The exiles noticed these signs, not with exclamations, but with quiet glances, as though acknowledging that life still unfolded even in this place of banishment. Summer, by contrast, pressed itself upon every surface. The sun burned through mist and painted the cliffs in stark light, so that shadows shrank into narrow pools beneath the pines. The sea darkened, glistening with heat, and the air filled with the scent of resin drawn from the bark of the trees. It was in these months that labor became most demanding, for the fields required constant tending, and the shoreline yielded fish that spoiled quickly if not salted or dried. Men worked with heads bent, sweat staining their robes, their breaths heavy but steady, the rhythm of their labor echoing the rhythm of their years. Autumn softened the island again, and though it brought winds that rattled the shutters of their dwellings, it also gave a sense of relief. Grains were harvested, though in modest amounts, and roots were stored carefully in baskets lined with straw. The air carried the scent of drying herbs, hung beneath eaves in small bundles, their colors muted by age but their use preserved by tradition. In the evenings, the exiles sat longer beneath the trees, gazing at the reddened sky as the sun dipped low. They did not speak of the harvest as fortune or failure. They merely accepted what had come, the way they had accepted exile itself. Winter was the longest, a season that pressed itself upon the soul as much as upon the body. Winds swept down from the cliffs, howling through the groves, rattling doors and shutters. The sea grew violent, throwing spray across the rocks, its surface shifting with storm and foam. In those months, the men remained close to their fires, wrapped in layers of patched cloth, eating sparingly from their stores. The sound of firewood cracking became the central pulse of their evenings, a rhythm as steady as the waves outside. Hunger was sharper then, and silence heavier, yet they endured it with the same composure that marked all their days. Despite hardship, the rituals of their past lives never vanished. Each man maintained the habit of cleaning his blade, however dull it had become. Even if the sword would never again see combat, the cloth was drawn along its length, oil applied with care, and the blade rested in its scabbard as though waiting for a call that would never come. In these gestures, the exiles preserved fragments of identity that neither the sea nor the years could wash away. Some still practiced movements, silent kata, performed in the clearing beneath the trees. Their feet pressed the earth. Their hands traced the memory of strikes and parries, their bodies shifting with the discipline of years of training. These movements were not preparation for battle but a form of meditation, a way of breathing with the island itself. The wind moved with them, carrying the scent of pine and the salt of the sea. Others found solace in tasks more practical but equally deliberate. Rope was woven from strands of reed, fishing nets patched again and again until the repairs became a tapestry of endurance. Clothing was mended with threads pulled from older garments, patterns of stitches recording the silent chronicle of necessity. Even the sharpening of wooden tools took on the weight of ritual, the rasp of stone against edge repeating like a chant. At times, the men gathered to share warmth around a single fire, their faces lit by its glow, their shadows stretching long across the tatami. Words were few, but presence itself became a form of companionship. Silence was not emptiness. It was shared space, acknowledgement of endurance together. In those circles of light, with the storm pressing against the walls, they resembled not outcasts but keepers of an ancient rhythm, bound to one another by circumstance and by the code that still lived, however quietly, within them. The island itself seemed to mirror their condition. It was solitary, battered by the sea, yet unyielding. Its cliffs bore the scars of countless storms. Its soil yielded grudgingly. Its trees bent but never broke. In its harshness, it offered a reflection of the men who lived upon it, marked by exile, weathered by time, yet never erased. On certain nights, when the air was clear, the stars spread thick across the sky, more numerous and brilliant than those seen in cities. The men would lie upon the ground outside their dwellings, gazing upward in stillness. For some, the constellations recalled tales told long ago. For others, they were simply lights that reminded them of the distance between themselves and the world beyond. Yet always, beneath those stars, the island seemed less like a prison and more like a vessel drifting quietly through endless time. And so the rhythm continued. Work and rest, hunger and subsistence, silence and memory. Days unfolded not as events but as a steady passage, each one bearing the weight of survival, each one preserving dignity in its smallest gestures. In this way, the forgotten samurai endured, their exile no less real, but their presence no less profound. Among those who lived upon the island, differences in age and bearing revealed themselves slowly, as though each man carried a quiet chronicle etched upon his face, his posture, and his manner of moving through the narrow paths between the dwellings. There were men whose hair had turned white long ago, their eyebrows heavy and their skin mapped by deep lines, but who still carried themselves with the erectness of their youth. There were others, younger in years, but with gazes already shadowed by silence, their hands calloused beyond what their age would suggest, their bodies lean from a life pared down to labor and necessity. The elder among them moved with deliberate care, as though each step had been measured and rehearsed in advance. Sandals shifted softly over the earth, robes trailing at the ankles, hands tucked calmly within sleeves. Their backs were not stooped, though their shoulders sometimes betrayed the slow weight of time. When they sat, it was always with the same formality they had carried through years of discipline. Legs folded beneath them, spines straight, eyes lowered in a gaze that seemed always inward. The stillness of their presence was not fragility but the refinement of restraint. Hair told its own story upon the island. Once carefully arranged topknots and polished helmets of black hair had long since given way to the streaks of white, to the rough edges of hair cropped by simple knives, to strands that escaped binding cords. Yet even here, some preserved the old style as best they could, tying what remained with quiet persistence, not for display but for themselves, as though each knot secured a fragment of memory. Beards, where they grew, were seldom tended in the old fashion, yet the men carried them with dignity, as though the passage of time itself was another garment to be worn without complaint. Hands bore the strongest marks of their exile. Fingers once trained to hold the hilt of a sword with elegance and precision were now roughened by rope, stone, and wood. Skin was hardened, nails darkened, knuckles swollen by years of labor. Yet when these same hands touched a blade, even one dulled and seldom used, the old delicacy returned, a reminder of the refinement that endured beneath the weathering of exile. Each gesture, from the act of lifting a bowl to the ritual of adjusting a robe, carried the memory of discipline. Younger men, those who had come to the island in the years following its first settlements, bore themselves with restraint as well, though their bodies revealed both hunger and strength. Shoulders were narrow, muscles drawn tight and lean, eyes quick to glance but slow to express. Their speech was measured, never excessive, their laughter rare but quiet when it appeared. They had not known long service in courts, nor years of standing watch in the households of lords, yet the code lived in them too, shaped less by experience than by the presence of those around them, whose every gesture served as instruction. In the evenings, when the work of the day had ended and fires flickered in their hearths, the differences between generations became clearer. The elders sat in contemplative silence, their gazes lingering upon the flames, their faces lit with an amber glow. Younger men, though also quiet, sometimes shifted restlessly, fingers tracing patterns upon tatami mats, or glancing toward the sea as though imagining a horizon beyond exile. Yet no word of departure was spoken, for departure was not possible. In their silence, the longing remained unshaped, a shadow without voice. The marks of time upon their bodies were many. Scars lingered on arms and shoulders, reminders of battles long past, now faded into pale lines against the skin. Knees bent more stiffly in some, backs creaked when rising from low seats, breaths came heavier with each ascent of the slopes. Hunger left its own signature. Cheekbones sharpened, ribs visible beneath robes, the slow thinning of limbs. Yet dignity endured even in frailty. Each robe was straightened before sitting, each gesture completed with care, so that weakness never descended into disorder. Gestures of daily life became their unspoken language. One man, lifting a cup to drink, always held it with both hands, his bow of acknowledgement lingering before each sip. Another, when sitting, adjusted the folds of his robe with a precision that suggested the movement of armor plates, as though the memory of battle still guided his body. A third touched the hilt of his sword before every meal, not dramatically, but with a subtle brush of fingers, an unbroken habit that required no audience. These gestures, repeated without fail, created an atmosphere in which memory and presence were interwoven, as inseparable as the sound of waves and the silence of night. Among them was one who carried a limp, his step uneven, the result of an injury long before exile. Yet he never faltered in his duties. Each morning he descended to the shore, nets carried upon his shoulder, and though his pace was slower than the rest, his hands were steady, his patience greater. Others moved more quickly, but his persistence matched their strength. The limp became less a sign of weakness than of endurance, a quiet emblem of survival. Another figure was remembered for his voice, though he seldom used it. When he did, it was deep and steady, carrying the authority of years of command. Even in exile, even when speaking only of ropes or tools, the tone shaped silence into attention. The younger men often listened without question, not because orders were given, but because the weight of his voice carried the same resonance as the waves against the cliffs, slow, enduring, impossible to ignore. One of the youngest was known for his stillness, for the way he seemed to dissolve into the background of the pines. His eyes were narrow, his body thin, yet his movements revealed sharpness, an attentiveness to every sound and shift in the air. Though he spoke little, his silence was not emptiness but a watchfulness that gathered the world without judgment. Others sometimes glanced toward him, sensing that he bore within him both the memory of the past and the possibility of what might still come. The island itself bore witness to these figures as though it, too, remembered. Paths were worn deeper by their footsteps, stones polished smooth where hands had rested, beams darkened where shoulders had leaned. Each gesture left a trace upon the landscape, just as the island left its mark upon their bodies. Together, man and place shaped one another, becoming inseparable in the long rhythm of exile. Their shared life unfolded not as a single story, but as a weaving of countless small patterns, each man's gestures interlacing with those of another. No one declared himself a leader, for exile had stripped titles and ranks away, yet order arose naturally, shaped by the experience and endurance of the elders, and by the attentiveness of the younger men who learned in silence. In this way, the settlement moved as a single body, not with urgency, but with the steady rhythm of survival. The tasks of each day were distributed without command. One man would rise earlier than the rest, preparing nets at the shore, and without words others would join him, carrying baskets and rope. Another, older and slower in step, walked to the fields to examine stalks, to touch the soil with his calloused hand. Soon 2 or 3 would be beside him, turning earth, binding stems. A few tended the fires, collecting driftwood and pine branches, ensuring the hearths did not go dark even in storms. In the evenings, when food was prepared, each portion found its way to hands waiting, without quarrel or complaint. It was not the voice of one that arranged these rhythms, but the presence of all, the invisible agreement of necessity. The quiet balance was sustained through gestures more than words. A nod was enough to signal readiness. The lifting of a tool spoke of labor to come. When one faltered with a heavy load, another stepped forward to take the weight, not with speech or display, but with seamless movement. Even disagreement, when it appeared, dissolved without argument, for silence itself became a form of acceptance. The island, with its unyielding austerity, permitted no room for conflict beyond the unavoidable. All energy was reserved for endurance. Meals, though spare, were the moments where companionship most clearly revealed itself. Bowls were set in a circle, the firelight touching each face in turn. The eldest often placed his bowl last, ensuring others were served before him, though no one spoke of it. The youngest would lower his gaze in acknowledgement, and though words seldom passed, respect moved like a current between them. The act of eating together, of sharing hunger, became a bond stronger than conversation. In the long hours of winter storms, When winds shook the walls and the sea struck against the cliffs, the men gathered closely in a single dwelling. Firelight painted the beams above, shadows flickering across their robes. Some mended tools, some bound straw into rope, some sharpened edges with slow, patient strokes. Others simply sat, hands folded, gazes steady upon the flames. The sound of work blended with the groan of the wind, until silence itself became another kind of speech. They did not need to speak of endurance, for their presence within that circle declared it more fully than words could. Occasionally, memories surfaced, not in stories told aloud, but in the gestures that lingered in the air. A man adjusting his robe in the manner once required by court etiquette, another lowering his head as though in the presence of a lord no longer there, a hand resting longer than necessary upon the hilt of a sword that would never again be raised. These remnants were not shared narratives, but they were seen, recognized, and silently honored by the others. Thus, memory became communal, not through speech, but through acknowledgement. The younger men learned through observation. They studied the patience with which elders endured hunger, the quiet dignity with which labor was performed, the way silence could hold weight without emptiness. In the absence of teachers, every action became instruction, every habit a lesson. Their lives were shaped not by explicit command but by immersion in the atmosphere of endurance. Slowly, their own gestures grew similar, until age itself seemed less a measure of years than a pattern absorbed. Shared suffering, too, created bonds that no ceremony could equal. When storms destroyed part of a dwelling, all hands moved together to repair it. When illness struck, others brought water, firewood, and what food they could spare, sitting near the ailing man so that he was not alone. When harvests failed and rations shrank to near nothing, no one spoke of fairness or injustice. Bowls were filled equally, and each man accepted less, knowing the others had done the same. The code of their former lives had taught them to honor lords, to die without fear, to place duty above the self. Here, stripped of lords and battle, that same code survived as mutual care, as an unspoken vow to endure together. Even moments of solitude became part of their shared rhythm. Some men walked the cliffs alone, gazing out upon the endless horizon, yet others noticed their absence without concern, trusting in the silence that bound them. The return of each man was marked not by greeting but by the subtle adjustment of presence. A place shifted around the fire, a bowl set out, a nod exchanged. In this way, solitude did not divide them but wove itself into their companionship. There were nights when the sea was calm, the stars sharp above, and a rare sense of peace settled upon the island. The men would sit outside, each in his own stillness, yet bound by the same gaze upward. The constellations spoke differently to each, recalling battles, journeys, or fragments of home, but their silence was shared, and that sharing transformed the night into something more than exile. It became a communion with the sky, with the sea, with one another, a reminder that even in forgetfulness, they were not alone. Thus their life, though marked by hunger and silence, by the endless rhythm of labor and waiting, unfolded as a kind of hidden harmony. Not the harmony of celebration, but the deeper harmony of endurance, of men bound not by command but by necessity, not by glory but by survival. The island shaped them, and they shaped one another, until their lives resembled the pines upon the cliffs. Bent by winds, rooted in stone, weathered, enduring, and quietly beautiful. Within the silence of the island, the men began to dwell more deeply in the chambers of their own thoughts. Days were filled with labor, but nights opened a space for memory, and in that stillness the weight of the past pressed gently yet unrelentingly upon them. Each man carried his history within him like a concealed wound, invisible to others yet constantly felt. No words were needed for these burdens, for the posture of a body, the length of a gaze into the fire, or the tightening of a hand upon a worn sash revealed enough. For many, the notion of honor was no longer a banner lifted high, but a faint ember carried in secret. Once, it had been visible in banners, in armor polished to gleam beneath the sun, in the reverence of vassals and the fear of enemies. Now it persisted only in quiet choices, in the refusal to eat more than one's share, in the patience with which hunger was endured, in the unspoken promise to preserve the dignity of those who had fallen into despair. Honor, once thunderous, now moved like a whisper between them. Some men remembered the clamor of battles long past, not as triumphs but as echoes of blood and smoke. The cries of dying comrades returned at times in dreams, or in the rhythm of the seas crashing against the cliffs, which seemed to echo the pounding of war drums. Such memories did not lead to pride but to weariness, to a recognition of the futility that had cast them upon this island. Yet even in this recognition, there was a kind of peace. The knowledge that violence had ended, that the sword lay quiet, that death need not be sought in a blaze of defiance but would arrive naturally as the tide returns to shore. Others recalled home villages, distant mountains, or the faces of families they would never see again. These recollections surfaced like drifting smoke, bittersweet and fleeting. The scent of pine resin in the wind might stir the memory of childhood forests. The taste of salt fish might recall a wife's careful cooking. Yet each memory faded quickly, leaving only a faint ache that was neither torment nor comfort, but something between. In this way, the past became both present and absent, always near yet always untouchable. A few clung to rituals as anchors for the spirit. Before labor, one man still bowed toward the sea, not in worship but in remembrance of discipline. Another kept his blade polished, though it would never again be raised. The gleam of steel reflected his own hollowed face, reminding him both of who he had been and who he had become. Such gestures, repeated without necessity, carried meaning deeper than survival. They were fragments of identity preserved against the erosion of time. The younger among them bore different burdens. For them, exile was not merely loss, but a shaping force. They had not known the full stature of a samurai's life in courts and fields of battle. Their memories were shorter, their sense of belonging less fixed. They watched the elders carefully, learning not just how to till soil or mend nets, but how to inhabit silence without despair. For them, endurance was not an echo of a greater life once lived. It was life itself, complete in its austerity. Their honor was not diminished, but altered, grown from stone and salt rather than from banners and ceremony. At times, death entered their thoughts not with fear but with familiarity. Some nights, a man would sit by the shore, staring into the vast black horizon where sky and sea became indistinguishable. In that endless darkness, the idea of release seemed neither frightening nor sorrowful, but like the natural continuation of the sea's rhythm. The code of their youth had taught them that death embraced with dignity was better than a life of disgrace. Yet here, disgrace was not an enemy. It was the fabric of their existence, shared by all, softened by silence, rendered almost gentle. Still, there were men who carried despair too heavily, whose spirits bent low beneath the burden of exile. These men withdrew, eating less, speaking never, their eyes hollow as though gazing inward. The others did not reproach them. Instead, they allowed their solitude yet kept watch from afar. A bowl of rice placed near, a robe adjusted over sleeping shoulders, a steady hand at the wrist when fever rose. These quiet acts held them close, preserving life until the will to live returned, or until the sea claimed them without struggle. Through these unspoken exchanges, the men began to recognize that exile itself had transformed the meaning of their existence. They had been warriors, bound by oath to lords, to laws, to hierarchies. Stripped of these, they discovered another order, one shaped by shared endurance, by quiet compassion, by the steady acceptance of what could not be changed. Their inner lives, once ruled by the demands of honor and ambition, were now governed by patience, by silence, by a dignity that asked nothing but to persist. As months turned to years, their faces grew more lined, their hair touched by gray, their hands roughened beyond recognition. Yet within those changes there was also a calm acceptance. Aging upon the island did not mean decline, but a deepening of stillness, as though each man became more a part of the rock, the pine, the sea. Their inner selves, once restless, found a strange harmony with the landscape. They too were weathered, enduring, forgotten, yet enduring still. In the quiet nights, when firelight flickered and the wind grew soft, a profound stillness often descended. It was in these moments that their inner states revealed themselves most clearly. Not in words, not even in gestures, but in the deep calm of men who had faced all loss and yet remained. Within that silence, exile no longer seemed a punishment, but a transformation. They were no longer warriors, nor merely survivors, but something in between, men who had learned to carry emptiness as though it were another form of honor. Over time, the silence that had surrounded the men ceased to be a mere absence of words and began to resemble a code of its own. Though no parchment bore their signatures, and no brush had drawn the symbols of agreement, the rhythm of their days unfolded with a constancy that carried the weight of law. What once had been scattered acts of survival slowly congealed into a shared order, a framework of living that none had declared yet all obeyed. It was understood, without speech, that each man would take no more than what he needed, leaving the rest for the others. Food, scarce as it often was, became not a matter of hunger alone, but of restraint and fairness. Bowls were filled evenly, hands never lingered upon an extra portion, and if one among them faltered, his share was quietly preserved. In this way, hunger, which could have driven men into cruelty, became the forge of their unspoken discipline. Work, too, arranged itself into a rhythm. Some rose to gather driftwood or mend the nets, others tended the shallow fields or carried water from the spring. No voice commanded this division, yet the tasks never lay unattended. If a man weakened, another would take his place, not as an act of charity but as part of a greater whole. They did not name it duty, yet it carried the same weight as the vows once sworn before lords and banners. There were gestures that became ritual. Before eating, many paused for a moment, lowering their eyes, not in prayer but in silent acknowledgement of the sea, the soil, and the unseen hands that had labored for the day's sustenance. At the close of work, tools were set aside with care, blades polished even if unused, garments folded with patience. These small acts, repeated without fail, carried the dignity of a code older than exile, a continuation of discipline that made their forgotten lives feel whole. Disputes, when they arose, dissolved before they formed. A glance, a pause, averted eyes were often enough to soften tension. No man sought dominance, for none could claim it. They were equals in their abandonment, bound not by rank but by survival. In that equality a quiet respect flourished. Age was honored not with titles but with patience. Youth was guided not with reprimand but with example. Without command, there was harmony. Without law, there was order. They began, almost unconsciously, to measure themselves not by deeds of arms but by endurance, by the stillness of their hearts, by the steadiness with which they carried one another. A man who bore hunger with grace was esteemed as once a warrior who had borne the weight of armor. One who tended the sick without complaint was held in quiet regard, as once a retainer loyal unto death. What had been valor and loyalty became care and endurance, softened by silence yet no less noble. At night, by the fire's dim glow, these unwritten codes seemed to gather like smoke above them. None spoke of them, yet all felt their presence. The flames lit their weathered faces, casting shadows that wavered like calligraphy upon the walls of stone. In those shadows lived the memory of laws once proclaimed, of codes once inscribed, and beside them a new code, unseen yet binding, born not of lords but of necessity, not of ceremony but of survival. In time, it became clear that this silent order was more enduring than the commands of their past. The lords who had banished them were long distant, perhaps dead. The banners of their clans had been scattered by years. Yet here, upon a nameless island, discipline had returned, not imposed by authority but breathed forth from silence itself. The forgotten samurai, stripped of their stations, had become the keepers of a new way, living by a law that none had written but all obeyed. And in that law there was peace, not the peace of conquest, nor the peace of submission, but the peace of men who had looked upon ruin and fashioned from its remnants a life that could be endured. Their code was not carved into stone, nor proclaimed in halls, but carried within their gestures, their restraint, their quiet endurance. It was a code that needed no name, for it was life itself, shaped by silence, and bound to the rhythm of the sea. In the slow unfolding of their days, the men began to sense that their order did not end at the boundary of their camp, nor with the limits of their own endurance. The code they had shaped, without word or writing, seemed to press outward, touching the soil, the air, and the sea itself. It was as though the island, which had once appeared only as a prison of rock and salt, was now bound into their law, its elements woven with their breath, its rhythms married to their own. The earth beneath their feet offered more than ground for survival. It gave them roots, a steadiness of being. The shallow fields they carved from stubborn soil became places of reverence, not because of abundance. Harvests were often thin, the stalks bent and wiry, but because the tending itself became ritual. Hands that once grasped hilts now sifted dark earth, and each furrow turned by calloused palms seemed like a vow renewed. They no longer looked upon the ground merely as a source of food, but as a companion in their endurance, a silent keeper of their patience. The sea too grew to be more than a barrier. In the beginning it had mocked them with its endless horizon, reminding them of the homes and clans forever beyond reach. Yet as months slipped into years, the sea altered its place within their lives. Its sound became the breath that marked the passage of their days, its shifting colors the silent script upon which their moods were written. When storms broke, they did not curse its violence but received it as stern instruction, a lesson in humility. When its waters calmed, silver beneath the moon, they felt their own silence mirrored back to them. The law of the sea was one of constancy. It yielded fish sparingly, it demanded vigilance, it took with equal hand as it gave. In that constancy they found kinship, and the sea became judge and ally alike. The wind was perhaps the most elusive of their companions. It circled through their camp at dawn, cool and dry, carrying scents of salt and pine. It whistled against the rocks at night, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, as if shifting from reprimand to counsel. They began to read the wind not only for weather but for meaning, taking its sudden gusts as reminders of vigilance, its stillness as a call to restraint. A fire fed too greedily would be extinguished. Garments hung carelessly would be carried away. Thus the wind became another voice in their law, one that spoke without words but always carried consequence. Even fire, that old friend and danger, was drawn into the circle of their order. It warmed their nights, cooked their food, lit their gatherings of silence. Yet it also demanded balance, for wood was scarce, and flames left untended might consume what little they possessed. So they tended fire with the same care they once gave to the sharpening of blades, treating it as a living member of their fellowship. Each ember preserved became an act of foresight. Each spark guarded a gesture of discipline. Through these elements, the samurai came to feel that their code was no longer theirs alone. It had spread outward, into the soil and the waves, into the winds and the flame. They obeyed the island not as captives but as adherents, as if nature itself had become their lord, dispensing laws that no human voice could alter. The harshness of this rule was undeniable, yet its fairness was beyond reproach. To labor brought sustenance, to neglect brought want, to overreach invited ruin, to endure with patience invited peace. In time, this bond with the island shaped the very rhythm of their bodies. Their movements grew slow but precise, conserving strength yet never careless. Their gestures, folding garments, carrying water, setting tools, echoed the rhythms of tide and season. The slowness of age came upon many of them, yet it did not diminish their presence. It seemed instead to settle upon them like a mantle, as though the island itself had clothed them in gravity. Each line upon their faces marked the passage of seasons as clearly as rings within a tree. The code they followed had no ceremony of oath or proclamation, but it found expression in countless small rites. Stones were stacked at the edge of fields not merely to mark boundaries but to give shape to memory. When fish were caught, the first was always set aside, not eaten until it had been shared among all. A tree felled for wood was given a moment's stillness, a pause in which hands rested upon its bark as if to thank it for surrendering its life. These acts, repeated without name or command, became as binding as any code once written upon scrolls. Night brought with it the deep voice of the sea, the whisper of wind, and the crackling of the fire. In these sounds, the men felt surrounded by presences older than themselves, presences that had borne witness to countless lives and would endure beyond their own. Sitting by the flames, watching sparks rise and vanish, they no longer thought of themselves as forsaken. They had become part of a greater rhythm, a law of silence and endurance that held not only men but the world itself. The island was not gentle, but its sternness was steady. It demanded balance and gave no reward for excess. A man who took too much from the soil found his harvest diminished the following year. A net cast recklessly into the sea often returned empty. A fire stoked without measure left them shivering before dawn. Through hardship the island taught restraint. Through repetition it taught patience. The samurai, once men of sword and oath, became men of rhythm and season, their code now indistinguishable from the elements around them. Over years, they ceased to wonder if their lives would ever return to the world beyond the horizon. The memory of distant banners, once vivid, grew thin like smoke scattered by wind. Yet what replaced it was not despair but a different kind of belonging. The law they had found here was no less real than the one they had lost, and in many ways it was purer, for it asked nothing but balance, it gave nothing but truth, and it left no place for vanity. In surrendering to it, they had discovered a peace that conquest and honor had never granted. Thus the island, once a prison, had become their temple. Its stones were their walls, its waves their chants, its wind their counsel, and its fire their light. They were bound not by decree but by the breathing of the world around them. And in that bond, they found not exile but a home, not loss but a law written in silence, vast as the sea and enduring as the earth itself. The island's rhythm wove itself not only into the gestures of their work but into the very fabric of their thoughts. As seasons repeated, the men began to see their own lives reflected in the cycles that governed everything around them. They came to measure time not by battles or decrees, but by the blossoming of wild shrubs, the retreat of tide pools, the brittle sound of frost upon early grass. A life once counted in victories and losses was now reckoned in subtler increments. the growth of a gourd vine curling across a fence of driftwood, the return of migrating birds, the first firefly hovering above the field at dusk. What once felt like exile softened into a strange form of belonging. Their wounds, both visible and hidden, began to align with the land's own scars. Rocks worn by centuries of waves seemed akin to their weathered faces. Trees bent by wind mirrored their own stooped shoulders. Even the silence between them carried weight, like the stillness between gusts of air. Where once silence meant the absence of command, now it meant communion between themselves, the island, and the law that held them all. Over time, each man discovered that the elements shaped not only their survival but their character. Those who had been impetuous learned caution from the sea's sudden squalls. Those who had been rigid softened before the wind's restless movements. Those once proud of strength bowed to the patience of soil, which yielded only after long toil. And those who had relied on the power of flame came to see its fragility, how quickly it could vanish if not tended. Thus the island, stern yet impartial, tempered them as a forge tempers steel, not with the heat of battle but with the long rhythm of endurance. The island also asked them to see themselves as part of a greater chain. Every fish they caught seemed tied to the shifting of currents far beyond their reach. Every stalk of millet grew only because the soil, rain, and wind had conspired to allow it. This awareness deepened their humility. They no longer looked upon their own hands as sole authors of their survival. Instead, they saw their hands as one link in an unending pattern, each gesture joined to countless others. To lift a stone, to gather wood, to pour water. All these actions seemed now to echo in the wider breadth of the island. Their code, once unwritten, became etched in subtle acts. At dawn, when the mist rose from the sea, they would bow their heads in stillness before beginning their tasks, not to honor any lord or temple, but to honor the rhythm that had allowed them another day. When storms lashed the coast, they did not retreat in fear but gathered together, silent, as though bearing witness to the island's own voice raised in command. Even their rest bore the weight of law. When the day's labor ended, no man ate until the fire was lit and its warmth shared among all. The island's creatures, too, entered their fellowship. Birds that nested upon cliffs became guardians of season, their calls announcing the approach of storms. Crabs that scuttled across wet sand reminded them of persistence, each small life pressing forward with tireless purpose. Even the howling of distant wolves upon wind-swept ridges carried meaning. Their cries spoke of hunger, of endurance, of kinship in struggle. The samurai began to look upon these animals not as intruders or prey alone, but as fellow adherents to the same vast, silent law. As years passed, the distinction between men and island thinned. The camp, once a scattering of crude shelters, now seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Driftwood walls blended with wind-stooped trees. Smoke from fires merged with low clouds. Paths worn by their steps became indistinguishable from deer trails. Even their tools seemed touched by the land. Blades dulled into shapes that fit their hands like stones smoothed by water. Baskets frayed until they seemed woven from seaweed itself. Nothing remained untouched by the island, and in turn, the island carried the mark of their lives. Though their numbers dwindled with time, the loss of each man was received not with despair but with solemn continuity. A mound of stones, raised carefully by surviving hands, marked the place where a body was laid. Yet these were not graves in the old sense, for the men did not think of their companions as gone. The stones stood as reminders that the earth now held them fully, that they had become part of the very ground that fed those who remained. The sea, the soil, the wind, and the fire gathered each of them back into itself. Thus even death fell under the same law, neither defeat nor triumph, but return. In this way, the law of the island shaped not only their daily labor but their understanding of honor itself. Once, honor had been bound to lords, to battles, to names written in registers. Here, honor became simpler and yet deeper. To waste nothing, to endure hardship without complaint, to accept one's share of work, to tend fire for others, to bow before the sea's vastness. Each small act bore the same weight as once did sword strokes in battle. To live rightly, even in exile, was to give form to an unseen order that stretched far beyond them. There were nights when the sky cleared so fully that the stars appeared like countless grains of salt scattered across black stone. In such moments, they felt the lull reach beyond the island, beyond the sea, into the endless breadth of heavens. The stars seemed to mirror the sparks of their fire, rising and vanishing, countless yet ordered. They understood then that their code was not merely of soil or tide but of the universe itself, that the same law binding fire and sea bound also the stars. To sit in silence beneath that sky was to feel oneself small yet whole, part of something vast and without end. Thus the eighth cycle of their life unfolded, not in grand deeds or distant wars, but in the slow weaving of man into earth, breath into wind, hunger into sea, warmth into flame. The island had become their master, their comrade, their judge, and their shrine. And in its stern but steady embrace, they found not despair but a deep, unspoken peace, a belonging more enduring than any they had once known in the lands they had lost. With the passing of many seasons, the men who had once called themselves wanderers began to feel that the island itself leaned upon them, as if it expected a kind of guardianship in return for the life it granted. What had begun as exile, then survival, and later the discovery of order within the elements, now ripened into responsibility. It was no longer enough simply to live upon the land. They began to understand that they must also live for it. The notion did not rise in a single moment, nor with proclamation. It arrived like mist upon the shore, so gradual that no man could say when first it appeared. Perhaps it was in the day they found a tree split by lightning, yet still holding a cluster of green leaves. They took its fallen branches for fire, but they also set stones about its base, protecting the roots from erosion. Or perhaps it was in the way they began to spare the younger fish, releasing them back to the sea, knowing that without restraint, the future of the waters would falter. The thought of stewardship slipped quietly into their conduct, until every gesture bore its trace. Their code deepened with this new recognition. Fire was no longer merely warmth to be tended. It was a presence to be safeguarded, not wasted in careless flare. The sea was not only a giver of food but a domain whose balance must be respected. Its storms endured as rightful admonitions. The soil, which yielded grain and root, became a sacred pact between toil and patience, never to be stripped bare without rest. And the wind, which carried seeds, voices, and scents across the island, seemed a messenger too vital to ignore. Each element grew into something more than necessity. Each became a trust. The samurai found themselves walking the boundaries of the island with different eyes. Where once they searched only for game or firewood, now they traced the ridges and coasts as though patrolling a domain entrusted to them. Their movements acquired a measured vigilance. They noted the bending of reeds, the deepening of animal burrows, the shifting line of seaweed left by tide. Each change carried meaning. The land had become a scroll upon which the seasons wrote, and they had become its readers and its keepers. This guardianship altered even their silences. When they sat at night around the fire, listening to the slow breath of waves, their quiet was no longer only the stillness of fatigue. It bore the weight of attention. They had learned that to sit alert yet calm was itself a form of watchfulness, and that such watchfulness was the truest expression of their vow. No intruder threatened their shores, yet they watched as though the island might one day call upon them to defend it, not from armies of men, but from neglect, from forgetfulness, from the blindness that once belonged to their former lives. At times, the island seemed to respond. The gulls, usually sharp in cry and restless in flight, began to circle more closely over their camp, almost as if acknowledging the men's steady presence. Deer, once cautious shadows at the tree line, came nearer, grazing upon grasses that grew between their huts. Even the wolves that roamed distant ridges no longer howled in menace, but in a voice that echoed like a distant chant, blending with the men's own vigil. The boundary between man and creature grew porous, joined by the single thread of shared belonging. Their daily tasks took on the air of rituals. The gathering of water was not merely a chore but an act of reverence, performed with the same care as a warrior once offered to the cleansing of his blade. The mending of nets became a meditative gesture, each knot tied with an awareness of its necessity for the life of fish, sea, and man alike. When one among them rose before dawn to walk the shore, his steps across wet sand became an unspoken offering, a patrol not of conquest but of stewardship. The older men, whose hair had long since whitened, seemed to carry this duty most deeply. Their hands shook at times, yet when they reached for firewood or guided a younger man's grip upon a tool, the trembling seemed less weakness than testimony. They embodied the slow merging of body and land, frail yet rooted, as if their flesh were already half earth. Their watchfulness was not of sharp eyes but of patient presence. They did not need to speak, for the law they had lived by flowed visibly in the stoop of their shoulders, the rhythm of their breath, the deliberate pace of their steps across the soil. In the younger men, strength endured, but it was tempered by this inherited solemnity. They no longer boasted of muscle or skill, for such boasting felt alien upon this shore. Instead, they measured themselves by endurance, how long they could remain still by the fields to watch the wind's passage, how long they could kneel by the tide pools without disturbing their creatures, how long they could endure hunger when the sea withheld its catch. Patience became valor, and restraint became power. Seasons pressed upon seasons, and the island grew marked with their guardianship. Paths remained clear not because they cut them endlessly, but because they walked them daily, their steps shaping the earth in gentle permanence. Fields did not exhaust themselves because each harvest was followed by rest, each cutting by renewal. Fires never scarred the ground, for ashes were scattered carefully, feeding the soil. Even their shelters seemed designed less to resist the island than to yield to it. Walls angled with the wind, roofs bent with the rain, openings aligned with the sun's course. It was during a long storm, when the sea thundered for 7 days and nights without pause, that their sense of guardianship crystallized. Waves pounded cliffs until stone cracked. Winds tore branches from trees and flung them like arrows across the hills. The men gathered in their hall of driftwood and earth, sitting in darkness while rain poured through gaps in the roof. Hunger gnawed, and fatigue pressed upon them. Yet they remained still, silent, watchful. When the storm at last relented, they stepped outside not as survivors but as witnesses. Trees had fallen, yet new light filtered through the spaces they left. Rocks had shifted, but pools formed anew for fish and shell. The storm had reshaped the island, and the men knew their role was to bear witness to that reshaping, to honor its necessity. From that day, they spoke little of themselves as merely inhabitants. Though no words were written, though no oaths were uttered aloud, their conduct revealed the truth. They had become the island's sentinels. Each man understood his life as service not to any lord beyond the sea, but to the soil beneath his feet, the tides at his shore, the winds across his hut, the fire within his hearth. To live rightly was to guard these with patience, vigilance, and humility. When one among them died, the ceremony reflected this guardianship. No longer did they raise only a mound of stones. Now they planted trees beside the resting place, allowing roots to grow through the earth that sheltered the body. In time, these trees marked their graves not as scars but as living watchtowers, rising toward the sky. Thus the dead too became guardians, their silent forms merging with bark, branch, and leaf. The living would sit beneath these trees, listening to the rustle of foliage, as though it carried the voices of those who had gone before. This new order softened the fear of death. To die was no longer exile from life, but entry into the greater guardianship of the island. The men did not hasten that moment, but they welcomed it when it arrived, bowing to the thought that they would soon watch not with eyes but with roots, not with hands but with the endless patience of stone. Death was not the end of duty, it was its completion. In the stillness of nights that followed harvest, when the stars shimmered upon the sea's black mirror, they sensed that their guardianship extended beyond the island's visible borders. The ocean was vast, yet they felt themselves bound to its farthest edges. Winds carried their breath across unknown distances. The fire's smoke rose into the heavens, mingling with stars. The soil beneath them was kin to soil on distant lands. By guarding this place, they felt they guarded all places, as if the law of one shore could echo across the world. The island, once their prison, now seemed entrusted to them as a shrine of silence, and they, once warriors of forgotten lords, now stood as sentinels of earth, sea, wind, and flame. In this slow transformation, exile became service, and service became peace. Their swords had long since rusted, their armor lay buried beneath moss, but their watch endured, quiet, faithful, unending. And so the guardians remained, their presence woven into the very breath of the island, their vow carried not in words but in the rhythm of wind upon grass, the glimmer of starlight upon waves, the warmth of embers in the night. The slow seasons turned upon themselves, and the island deepened its hold upon the lives of the men. What had once been exile and punishment had become, in the passage of years, a rhythm of days so measured and quiet that they no longer thought of time as it had been reckoned before. The world they had known, of lords and banners, of steel flashing in ceremony or battle, had grown distant, like a half-remembered tale. The island had replaced it with something steadier, though no less binding. A law written not on paper, but in earth, in sea, in air. Each action, however slight, had begun to take on the shape of ritual. To gather driftwood was no longer a simple task of survival. It was performed with care, as though the very weight of the branches mattered. Stones lifted from the shore were set down in order, aligned with the tide's retreat, as if answering some unspoken pattern. When the men tilled the soil, their hands did not move in haste, but with a deliberation that seemed drawn from some invisible script. They had not agreed to such practices. No oath had been spoken, no charter written. Yet the silence of their days, the stillness of their surroundings, pressed them into a unity beyond intention. If one rose early, others soon followed. If one paused in labor, the pause became communal. Meals were taken without announcement, but each man seemed to know when the fire should be lit, when the rice should be washed, when the dried fish should be portioned. The wind across the island became a teacher. It whistled low among the reeds at dusk, reminding them to draw water before the dark. It groaned in the pines when storms threatened, and so they secured their shelters. The wind's changes were like commands, and they obeyed without resistance. The sea, too, had its voice in their law. The tide's retreat left markings on the sand, and these markings were studied as carefully as a warrior might once have studied an enemy's movements. The tide dictated when nets could be drawn, when shellfish might be gathered, when boats, crude though they were, could be steadied against the currents. The sea's vast stillness at dawn seemed to forbid loud speech or careless action, and the men moved gently, as though afraid to break the surface of that calm with their clamor. Fire, when kindled, took on the air of a sacred presence. It was never allowed to die carelessly. The embers were kept alive, passed from one hearth to another, guarded as though it were the very soul of the island itself. To waste wood or to scatter sparks recklessly would have seemed an offense, not only to their fellows but to the unseen balance they had come to respect. The earth gave its portion but demanded patience. Seeds, pressed into the soil, sprouted only with diligence and reverence. Weeds were not torn out in anger, but removed as though they were obstacles to harmony. Stones unearthed by the plow were set aside in careful mounds, marking the edges of fields as naturally as boundary posts in the provinces they had once served. As the years wound forward, these habits grew until they were indistinguishable from law. No voice declared them, yet each man knew them. The law of the island was not written, yet it was observed more strictly than the codes once taught in halls of learning. The silence of the samurai had become the silence of the earth itself. The men, in their aging bodies, reflected this order. Their gestures grew fewer, but more certain. When one stooped to lift a bundle of wood, it was done with the same precision with which he might once have drawn a bow. When another washed his hands before a meal, it was with a solemnity that made of the act a quiet ablution. Wrinkles upon their faces deepened with the same regularity as the grooves they carved into the soil. Gray hair gathered not as a mark of decline, but as a seal of endurance. They no longer sought glory, nor feared disgrace. Their days did not hinge upon honor as it had been once proclaimed in courts and on battlefields. Instead, honor had become the ability to move in accord with the island's order, to align one's breath with the rhythm of the tide, one's labor with the pattern of the seasons. Even the night became a part of this law. The stars, visible in the clarity of skies unbroken by lanterns or smoke, seemed to mark the passing of unseen guardianship. Constellations rose and fell, and the men marked their tasks according to these heavenly rotations. Sleep, too, was regulated not by decree, but by the quiet demands of the body, which had come to reflect the steadiness of the island itself. If a bird called at an unusual hour, it was noted as a sign. If the sea brought ashore drift from distant places, it was considered a message. Not superstition nor blind ritual, but rather a calm acknowledgement that the island spoke, and that to listen was wiser than to ignore. And thus the samurai became custodians, not merely of themselves, but of the island entire. To leave refuse upon the ground would have been unthinkable. To fell a tree without cause was felt as betrayal. The balance they observed was fragile, and they understood that their survival depended upon it. Yet beneath this steady surface was something deeper still. The law of the island was not only outward but inward. Each man, in the silence of his own thoughts, had come to find that the restraint once imposed by sword and master had now been replaced by an inner discipline. The sword was no longer at his side, yet his hands remembered. The master no longer gave commands, yet his body obeyed a rhythm all the same. The code lived on, but it had grown gentle, stripped of violence, tempered by the vast calm of exile. Sometimes, as the wind hushed across the valley, or as the sea glimmered under the moon, one or another of them would pause in labor and simply stand still. In those moments, no voice spoke, no movement stirred. Yet the silence itself was as binding as an oath, as though the island had gathered them into its keeping, and would not release them until their final breath. Thus the years gathered, and the men grew old. Yet the law remained steady, written not in ink, nor in blood, but in the ceaseless patience of the natural world, and in the hearts of those who had learned at last to follow it. The days upon the island moved with a quiet certainty, each one folding gently into the next, like waves rolling endlessly to the shore. The samurai had long ceased to measure time in years or moons. Instead, their awareness bent itself to the subtle shifts of wind, the deepening shades of water, the weight of silence that gathered in the air when storms approached, and the faint change in the voices of birds when the season began to turn. Life had lost its hurried edge and taken the shape of slow tides, patient and deliberate, echoing the rhythm of their breaths. Their laws, once forged with stern clarity upon the battlefield, now rested not in ink or carved tablets, but in gestures repeated each day. A glance exchanged when the fire was kindled, a bowed head as one carried water to the communal place, a hand smoothing the grain of wood before laying a plank in repair of a shelter. The code lived not as proclamation, but as rhythm, subtle, fluid, and unspoken, carried in the flesh and remembered in the bones. The elders among them bore their age with a quiet gravity. Their hair, now gray or white, moved like the foam of the surf when the wind grew restless. Their faces were lined, not with the harsh marks of battle, but with the soft etchings of patience. Their movements had slowed, yet each motion retained the dignity of careful intention. When they sat at the edge of the cliff, gazing into the horizon, the younger men saw in their stillness a kind of living scripture. Words were not needed. Their presence alone embodied a discipline that was unshaken by exile, hunger, or loss. The younger ones, though still marked by strength, had grown different than they would have been had they remained within the walls of a clan. Their strength was tempered not in duels, nor in the clash of armies, but in endurance of storms, in the carrying of stones for new hearths, in the repetition of small, necessary labors. They had learned to mend nets, to weave baskets, to draw water without spilling a drop, and to silence the restless stirrings of the heart when food grew scarce. Their courage was not the sudden blaze of the sword, but the quiet flame that kept them awake during long watches under dark skies. So their order deepened, until it became less a discipline imposed and more a natural alignment, as inevitable as the pull of the tides. They rose when the dawn spread pale silver upon the sea. They worked when the sun lifted itself over the horizon, warming the rocks and bringing salt-crusted driftwood to light. They ate when the work was done and rested when the air cooled. At night, they sat close to one another, feeling the warmth of fire upon their faces, listening to the breathing of the sea. In these patterns, time ceased to be an enemy. It became a companion, soft and enduring. The island itself seemed to have accepted them as its keepers. Its forests, once thick and wild, now bore the signs of measured care. Paths had been worn gently between the trees, not cut but persuaded into being by repeated footsteps. Stones had been lifted from fields where they grew their crops, laid in patient rows that guided rainwater and shielded seedlings from the wind. Shelters rose not as fortresses but as dwellings, made from branches, reeds, and driftwood, their roofs sloping to meet the wind rather than resist it. The sea gave them fish, sometimes in abundance, sometimes in stingy measure, and they received both with the same bow of acceptance. Among the samurai there had grown a practice of silence. Not a vow, not a command, but a habit that blossomed naturally from their shared rhythm. Words were spoken when needed, but often they passed whole days without more than a few sentences. This silence did not weigh heavy. Rather, it was filled with the voices of wind in the trees, the rustle of sand shifting under feet, the distant call of gulls, the slow breath of waves. In such silence, their thoughts moved more slowly, settling like dust upon still water. Memories of battlefields and clan banners came less often, and when they did, they drifted like faded smoke, touching the mind without stirring it. In time, they began to regard silence itself as one of their unwritten laws, not as denial, but as reverence, a recognition that their voices were not the only ones that mattered. When they sat together in the evening, each listening to the faint crack of firewood, they felt joined not merely by shared exile, but by the vast soundless presence that surrounded them, the island, the sea, the sky. There were days when storms gathered upon the horizon, dark walls of cloud advancing with low rumblings of thunder. Then the samurai moved with practiced certainty, securing roofs with heavier stones, binding ropes more tightly around shelters, bringing in what baskets or tools had been left to the open air. When the rains struck hard as arrows and the winds bent the trees nearly to the earth, they waited together in the half-dark, feeling the pulse of the storm as though it were the beating of a vast heart. These storms no longer frightened them. Instead, they taught them endurance and surrender. When the winds passed, the air smelled of freshness and broken branches littered the ground. They moved slowly among the wreckage, restoring what could be restored. Each storm became a teacher, and each act of mending a renewal of their law. The old code of honor, once written in steel and sealed with blood, had transformed into something quieter, yet no less binding. Where once they had spoken of courage, they now lived patience. Where once they had vowed loyalty to their lords, they now offered loyalty to one another, and to the earth that held them. Where once they had faced death in ritual clarity, they now faced life with humble endurance. Sometimes, in the pale stillness before dawn, an elder would rise and walk alone to the edge of the cliffs. There he would sit for hours, watching the slow unfurling of light upon the waters. The younger samurai, seeing him from a distance, did not follow. They understood that this too was part of their way. Solitude had become a practice, as vital as companionship. Each man, in his own time, would take such walks, and in that solitude, they felt the weight of their exile not as punishment but as a passage into something quieter, deeper. The sea remained their great companion. Its moods taught them humility. When calm, it offered food and reflection. When angry, it denied them both. Yet even in denial, they felt a kind of gift, a reminder that life was not theirs to command. They learned to mend nets with patience, to wait without complaint, and to receive whatever the sea gave as though it were the measured hand of fate. Some began to believe that the sea itself had become their lord, vast, unyielding yet merciful in its own way. Fire, too, had its place in their unspoken law. At night, when flames flickered and shadows shifted against the walls of their shelters, they sat close together, their faces softened by the glow. Fire was more than warmth. It was memory. Each spark seemed to carry echoes of the swords they once drew, of the banners that once burned, of the villages left behind. Yet in fire they also felt renewal. Food cooking, wood drying, wounds warmed back to life. They came to see fire as both destroyer and healer, an eternal balance they carried into their daily lives. As the years drifted by, their bodies bore the marks of labor. Hands thickened with calluses, shoulders bent with the carrying of wood and stone, skin darkened by the sun and salted by the wind. Yet there was dignity in this weariness. Each scar, each wrinkle, each ache became a mark of belonging. Their exile had stripped them of their names and banners, but in return, it had given them the imprint of the island, etched upon their flesh. They were no longer merely men who had once borne swords. They had become part of the land they walked, as much as the trees or the rocks that lined the shore. The younger ones, who had arrived with restless eyes and lingering dreams of return, no longer spoke of leaving. The thought of departure had faded like a ship vanishing beyond the horizon. The island was not a cage, but a circle, complete in itself, with sky above, sea around, and earth beneath. They no longer longed for the world they had lost. They breathed fully the world they had gained. Thus their law, unwritten and unspeaking, came to rest upon 4 pillars: earth, water, fire, and air. These were not proclaimed, but lived. To walk the soil with reverence, to meet the sea with patience, to guard the flame with humility, to breathe the wind with stillness. These became their vows. None declared them aloud. yet all kept them faithfully, as though each heart had carved them upon its walls. And so the days continued, unhurried, unfolding like the slow blooming of a flower. Their lives, once bound by the noise of armies and the burden of command, had entered a silence so complete that even the passing of years no longer weighed heavy. The island had become their temple, and they, without ever naming it, had become its monks. The rhythm of life on the island moved as steadily as the tides that brushed the shore. Yet within that stillness there arose a quiet understanding. Not all could bear the weight of silence, nor the discipline that the forgotten samurai had shaped for themselves. In the beginning, every man believed he could live according to the law of the winds and the code written in their hearts. But over the passing years, a different truth revealed itself. Some faltered, some strayed, and the island itself seemed to observe and respond. It began not with cruelty, but with distance. A man who broke the quiet order was not shouted at, nor dragged before a council of judgment. Instead, his brothers would withdraw their presence. Conversations would fade away before his arrival. Bowls of rice would be left one step farther from his place. The circle around the fire would seem to bend just slightly away from where he sat. This exile within their midst was more piercing than a raised blade. For these men had bound themselves to one another by necessity, and to be cut away from the fabric of companionship was to feel a kind of living death. The laws were not written in scrolls, yet they carried the sharpness of steel. A broken promise to the land, such as the waste of precious food or the neglect of shared tools, was treated as betrayal. A man who shirked his turn to fish, or who consumed more than his measure, would find the others silent toward him, their eyes lowered in sorrow rather than anger. The dishonored man would often correct himself quickly, offering to take extra burdens, to mend nets late into the night, or to guard the cliffs when storms made the night dangerous. In most cases, redemption came swiftly, for none wished to feel the cold shadow of exile. Yet there were some who could not endure the weight of such shame. These men walked away, deeper into the forests of the island, and though no one forbade their return, many did not come back. The silence of the woods swallowed them, and the sea, with its endless horizon, seemed to remind the others that no escape was possible. In time, such disappearances became their own form of punishment, as though the island itself absorbed those who could no longer walk the path of discipline. The samurai who remained saw in these events not cruelty but necessity. To keep their fragile society intact, there had to be consequence. Even honor, which had once been bound to sword and feudal master, now needed anchors in the daily motions of survival. In the absence of their lords, the island became the master, and its laws, expressed through silence and distance, were as binding as any command delivered from a castle dais. As the seasons turned, these patterns became formalized. When a man faltered, he was given 3 chances to return to the path. The first transgression was met with silence, the second with silence and distance, his tasks left untouched, his portion diminished by his own hand. The third was exile to the forest's edge, where he must dwell alone for a cycle of the moon. If he returned after this trial with humility, the circle opened to receive him. If not, the forest would keep him. Such customs seemed harsh to outsiders, yet on the island they grew from the marrow of necessity. The community could not afford weakness, nor the erosion of trust. Each man was both sword and shield to the others, and when that balance broke, so too did their fragile peace. The punishments were not without ritual. When one was sent into exile, the others accompanied him as far as the grove where the trees grew close, their roots tangled like the fates of men. They lit a lantern there and left it burning for 3 nights, a symbol that the door was not yet closed. If the dishonored one passed beyond the 3rd night without returning, the lantern was extinguished, and his name was no longer spoken. His place at the fire was left empty for a year, after which it was silently filled again. Thus the community healed itself, slow and deliberate, like scar tissue forming where once there had been a wound. Not all transgressions were treated equally. There were men who lost themselves in despair, who failed not through greed but through grief. For them, exile was softened, and a companion might sit with them on the edge of the forest, offering presence without words. In time, they too might walk back into the circle, though more fragile, their eyes touched by shadows that never quite departed. There were also times when an error endangered them all. A fire left untended, a watch abandoned during storm or raid, an act of recklessness that placed the group in peril. These required sterner consequence. For such men, the path of return was longer. Some chose to atone through acts of great labor, building shelters alone, tending the boats, or gathering food in treacherous waters. They became servants to the community, not through humiliation, but through visible proof of their renewed devotion. In their sweat and calloused hands, redemption was written. It was said among them that the island itself remembered every fault. A storm would break harder after a lie was spoken. Nets would return empty when quarrels poisoned the air. The old ones whispered that the land and sea had become their judges, and so each man carried not only his own honor but the weight of harmony with the elements. To fail was to upset that balance, and the punishments they devised were but reflections of the greater punishment the world itself delivered. Years passed in this fashion. The system of silence, exile, and atonement grew as steady as the rhythm of their days. It shaped the men as much as hunger and wind did. They became attuned to the smallest tremor in their shared life, careful in gesture and word. They spoke less, worked more, and each night around the fire they moved as one body, bound by threads invisible yet strong. Those who survived longest were not the strongest in body, but those most patient in spirit. They bore the silences without complaint, accepted exile as medicine, and returned humbled. In them the code of the forgotten samurai deepened, not as a list of rules but as a rhythm of being. Exile was no longer punishment alone. It was a reminder that each man was both alone and part of the whole. The fire needed every hand to gather wood, yet each hand must also know how to endure the cold of the forest. Thus, the island taught them again what they had once learned in the households of their lords, that honor was less about the blade than about the endurance of discipline. On the mainland, they had been cast away, dishonored, forgotten. On the island, dishonor was not final. It could be borne, atoned for, and cleansed through silence, labor, and humility. This truth, harsh as stone yet gentle as water, shaped the laws of their survival. The children of the waves, the gulls, the fish, the restless tides, became their witnesses. When a man returned from exile, often the sea was calm that night, as though granting permission. When one failed and vanished into the forest, storms rolled across the horizon, and the men around the fire sat more closely together, feeling the emptiness of the circle. In this way, punishment and exile became not merely social tools, but a part of their spiritual landscape. To be cast out was to be tested by the elements themselves. To return was to be reborn. The samurai did not speak of these things as philosophy. They lived them, day upon day, year upon year, until the code of exile became as natural as the sound of the surf. The island did not forgive easily, but it did allow renewal. And in that balance of silence and return, the forgotten samurai endured. The days upon the island moved forward with their slow procession, a cadence marked not by the clamor of cities or the ringing of temple bells, but by the quiet rotation of the natural world. The samurai who remained still abided by the codes they had drawn together, but a new element had begun to weave itself into their fabric of order. the knowledge that exile was not merely a distant memory, but a tool now held within their own small society. Just as once the shogun and lords of the mainland had cast them aside, now they, in their quiet severity, had begun to shape judgments for those among them who faltered. This emergence was not abrupt, nor was it clothed in the language of cruelty. It came instead like the steady turning of the tide, gradual, relentless, unnoticed until the waters had risen high upon the shore. A man who broke the rhythm of their law was not immediately condemned. First came silences, then a turning away of eyes during the evening gatherings, then the subtle rearrangement of duties that left him apart from the others. The punishment of exile was not only a removal from the shared hearth. It was a deep loneliness, as the murmurs of comradeship dimmed to nothing. Exile upon an island already set apart from the world bore a double weight. To be cast out even within such confinement was to be placed among the margins of the margins, a shadow on the periphery of a shadow. Those who found themselves in this position did not wander far, for there was nowhere to go, but they lived in huts apart, their fires no longer part of the collective glow. The scent of their cooking drifted faintly, but no bowls were passed to them, no hand offered rice in quiet solidarity. It was not the severity of violence, but the severity of silence that marked their fate. The samurai still believed themselves to be bound by honor, even in this diminished state, and so exile was regarded as both justice and mercy. Justice, for it protected the whole from disruption. Mercy, for it spared the blade. The sea itself became the wall of their justice. No one needed to enforce it with guards or bonds. To live apart was punishment enough, for the waves endlessly reminded them that beyond their small world lay a greater realm they could never return to. Those who lived in exile within exile began to form their own strange patterns. They fashioned solitary gardens, small patches of earth where herbs grew, where a trickle of water kept moss alive. Their huts were often neater than those of the others, as though the ordering of objects might quiet the disorder of the soul. Yet their eyes grew different, distant, and the gestures that once bound them to their brothers became hesitant, uncertain, like a hand half extended then withdrawn. There was one samurai, whose name was softened by time into a whisper no longer remembered, who became the first to endure such punishment. He had violated not a law of violence but of silence, breaking into speech where restraint was required, refusing to bow to the rhythm of the group. It was not rebellion in the fiery sense, but a fraying at the edges, a refusal to let his voice vanish into the vast hush of the island. And so he was set apart. His hut grew at the edge of a bamboo grove, where the wind carried the sound of leaves brushing one another like muted blades. For months he remained there, seen only at a distance, his shoulders bent not from labor but from the weight of being unwoven from the fabric of belonging. He survived, of course. There was no true lack of sustenance, but the absence of eyes meeting his eyes, of hands working beside his hands, hollowed him more than hunger ever could. He grew gaunt not from want of food but from want of presence. And yet, the others watched in silence, their own faces betraying no judgment, only the heavy acknowledgement that law had been kept. In this way the island's air thickened with a new kind of gravity. The samurai began to feel that each action carried more weight, that each gesture of discipline or neglect might be the first stone in a long wall of separation. Their honor was no longer only a matter of life and death, but of belonging or isolation. The silence that could envelop a man became a silence that hovered over them all, reminding them that exile was never far, that the tide could turn upon any one of them. Still, the seasons moved, and nature did not falter in its own cycle. The rains swept across the island with their heavy drums, washing away paths and reshaping the edges of the streams. The bamboo bent low, then sprang upright again, their resilience a quiet mirror to the men who bore their solitude. In the evenings, when the clouds parted, the stars hung vast and cold above them, like eyes that observed without judgment, endless and remote. The exiled ones too saw those stars, though from their own lonely hearths, and perhaps took some comfort that at least the heavens did not divide themselves into belonging and banishment. Over time, exile itself became less an extraordinary punishment and more a familiar presence, a ghost who moved among them even when unseen. They began to weave it into their codes, shaping subtle phrases that allowed for the possibility of separation without needing to name it directly. Their scrolls did not speak of punishment in sharp words, but of distance, of silence, of the outer path. In this way, the law became more natural, more seamless with their environment, until it seemed less like a decree and more like the inevitable shifting of the wind. The men who remained within the circle of belonging carried themselves differently now. Their gestures, once simple, grew deliberate. When a hand passed a bowl of rice, it lingered slightly longer, as though affirming the bond between giver and receiver. When they bowed in the evening shadows, the angle of their spines seemed deeper, the stillness afterward heavier, for each knew how precious was the act of inclusion. What had once been habit was now ritual, sharpened by the knowledge of what it meant to lose it. The island itself appeared to respond to these changes. The sea, which had always encircled them with its restless voice, seemed at times to echo the isolation of those set apart. Its waves pounded the rocks with relentless rhythm, each crash a reminder of boundaries that could not be crossed. Yet the forests, lush and murmurous, offered another lesson. That even fallen branches could shelter moss, that even a hollow trunk could hold life. The samurai looked upon these scenes with the quiet intuition that nature itself was instructing them, shaping their laws as surely as they shaped their scrolls. It was not only individuals who were exiled. At times, entire practices were abandoned, cast aside as though they too had violated some unspoken harmony. An old way of sharpening blades, a particular gesture of greeting, a ritual once performed at dusk. These were sometimes set apart, no longer woven into the daily rhythm. And in this exile of custom, too, there was both loss and renewal. The men learned to live with the ache of absence, while also discovering that space made way for new rituals, new bonds. Yet always the shadow of punishment lingered. It was a presence that both sustained and unsettled them. To know that silence could descend upon them at any moment was to live with a sharpened awareness, a perpetual attention to detail, a vigilance not only over the body but over the spirit. The island thus became a place of heightened perception, where even the smallest breach, a gesture too abrupt, a word too untimely, carried the weight of consequence. The younger among them, those who had not yet grown old, carried this awareness most acutely. They moved with a studied grace, watching the elders for cues, shaping their every act in accordance with the invisible threads of law. They trained themselves not only in the handling of blades or the endurance of hunger, but in the subtle art of belonging. When to be silent, when to bow, when to let a breath linger in the air before exhaling. Their apprenticeship was not to a single master, but to the collective rhythm, to the unseen code that bound them together. And yet, within this order, there remained a quiet tenderness. The very possibility of exile made inclusion all the more precious. When the men gathered in the long house and the light of the fire fell upon their faces, the warmth of the shared flame seemed brighter for the knowledge that it could be withdrawn. Each bowl of rice, each sip of tea, each nod of recognition was an affirmation of community, a soft but powerful shield against the loneliness that hovered just beyond. The exiled ones, too, were not forgotten entirely. In moments of reflection, the men would think of them, though they did not speak their names. They were like stones at the edge of a path, unnoticed by those who walked but still shaping the way the journey unfolded. Their absence gave contour to presence, Their silence gave weight to words. In this way, even exile became part of the whole, not merely a fracture but a necessary outline of the circle they lived within. Thus the island moved into a new season of its history. The samurai, once exiles themselves from the great mainland, had now built a smaller mirror of that same judgment within their own world. They had learned to cast out as they had been cast out, to silence as they had been silenced. And yet, in doing so, they also deepened their bonds, finding in the fragile balance between inclusion and exile the shape of their continued survival. The nights grew long, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and salt wind. The fires burned low, the stars wheeled in their silent courses, and the men, whether within the circle or beyond it, lay upon their mats listening to the vast hush of the sea. In that hush lay both the threat of exile and the promise of belonging, both the weight of judgment and the lightness of survival. And so they endured, bound together not by choice but by necessity, by the codes they themselves had written, by the silence they themselves had chosen. The years upon the island did not fall like stones into a river, distinct and counted. Instead, they drifted and dissolved, as if the seasons themselves no longer wished to keep a tally of time. Each cycle of wind and rain, each tide that erased the shore, seemed to fold into another, leaving only a quiet impression that life had persisted in silence. The samurai who had once arrived here as exiles of pride and error now lived as figures softened by patience, their past sharpness dulled into a tempered stillness. No ceremony marked the change of one decade to another. Yet in their bearing, in the way they walked the narrow paths among the pines, or in the tone of their breath during evening meditations, there was evidence that long years had settled upon their shoulders. Their hair thinned and silvered, their backs grew heavier, and their gestures, once trained into rigid precision, now carried the grace of acceptance. The island itself bore witness to their transformation. What had been first a wilderness of stone and wind slowly revealed itself as a place shaped by their care. Low walls of stacked rock traced the outlines of gardens. Footpaths hardened by countless steps wound from cliff to stream, their edges smoothed by moss. Groves of bamboo, once wild and tangled, stood straight, tended by patient hands. The sea remained untamed, yet even its endless restlessness seemed less hostile, as though it too had come to acknowledge the quiet fraternity of those who dwelled within its embrace. In the earlier years, discipline had been enforced by rule and ritual. Each man, carrying the memory of his former station, clung to the codex as if it were the last tether to a world lost behind him. Punishments were stern, and the act of banishment from the group weighed heavily upon those who faltered. Yet as time softened their resolve, the laws themselves began to resemble the rhythm of the island. They no longer looked upon their order as punishment or command, but as the natural breath of existence. To rise with the sun was no decree, but the inevitable call of the tide and the cry of gulls. To eat sparingly was not discipline, but necessity, and in that necessity they found purity. To work with stone, wood, and field was not service to authority, but communion with the land that held them. And thus, slowly, the fear of exile lost its sting. When a man faltered, when his body grew frail or his spirit heavy, the others did not cast him aside into the outer edges of the island. Instead, they carried him to a quiet place where the sea's voice was softer, where the pines bent to shield the wind, and there he was left to rest in dignity. Death came not as disgrace, but as the closing of a circle, the tide drawing back to the ocean that had birthed it. Some still held to the forms of ritual suicide, honoring the weight of a code too deeply carved to abandon. These acts, when they came, were no longer driven by shame, but by a profound desire to complete one's life in harmony with the code that had carried them. Such moments were not accompanied by spectacle, but by silence, and the silence itself carried more reverence than any ceremony could grant. The younger men, those who had arrived later or had aged more slowly, tended to the needs of the older. They brought water from the spring, gathered herbs, and prepared meals with careful hands. The bond of brotherhood, once forged by strict law, had transformed into something gentler, care given not from obligation, but from recognition of shared fragility. The samurai were no longer bound to one another as warriors, but as men who had faced the long erosion of time together, whose pride had melted into humility, whose exile had become belonging. Even the storms that battered the island seemed, in their later years, to have lost their violence. When the typhoons came, the men sat together in their shelters, listening as the wind tore at the earth. But instead of fear, they felt an intimate kinship with the storm's voice, as if the world outside echoed the turbulence that had long ago been tamed within their own hearts. The island became their monastery, their battlefield, their grave. Each stone and root, each bird's cry, each salt-worn plank of their huts became woven into a living scripture. The code they once carried upon scrolls or within memory was now written across the land itself. The sweep of the wind across the ridges was its voice, the shifting sand its impermanence, the quiet pools at low tide its meditation. As the years deepened, memory of the outside world grew faint. The cities of their youth, the castles of their lords, the clangor of battlefields, all faded like the haze of a dream upon waking. At times, a fragment returned. The scent of incense at a shrine, the glimmer of armor beneath torchlight, the measured step of a lord's procession. Yet these memories no longer carried the sting of loss. They were like autumn leaves carried upon the current of a river, beautiful in their briefness, unneeded in their passing. Some among them began to carve into wood and stone, shaping figures of guardians and deities. Their hands, once trained to the precision of sword and bow, found new expression in the slow patience of craft. These images, set upon the cliffside or within groves, did not depict war, but tranquility. Faces with closed eyes, gestures of open palms, the stillness of eternal watch. In these carvings, they sought not to preserve their past, but to honor the silence they had found. The community dwindled, not through strife, but through the natural waning of bodies. Graves marked by simple stones gathered beneath the pines, ashes scattered upon the waves. The island itself absorbed them, and their memory was carried not in words, but in the shape of the land they had tended. Those who remained grew accustomed to the emptiness, finding in it a mirror of their own solitude. In the final years, when only a handful still breathed the salt air, they no longer feared what awaited. Their exile had ceased to be punishment, ceased even to be exile. It had become life in its purest form, detached from ambition, from judgment, from the ceaseless turmoil of the world they once served. And so the end came, not as a sudden moment, but as a gentle settling, the way dusk drifts across the sky, slowly dimming, never abrupt. One by one, their fires ceased to be lit. One by one, the huts grew empty, until at last, the island held only the traces of their passage. The stones set into walls, the paths pressed by countless feet, the figures carved into wood and cliff. The sea continued its endless rhythm, erasing and remaking the shore. The wind carried the scent of pine and salt. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries unchanged. Yet in the stillness of the island, something lingered, a quiet resonance, as if the breath of the forgotten samurai remained woven into the land itself. Long after the last of them was gone, the island stood, shrouded in mist, a place beyond maps and memory. To any who might one day set foot upon its soil, it would seem nothing more than a silent wilderness. Yet within its silence lay the unspoken chronicle of those who had dwelled there, warriors who had been cast aside, who had surrendered pride to solitude, and who, in that solitude, had found a deeper form of belonging. The island of the forgotten samurai did not vanish with their passing. It endured, quiet and eternal, its stones and waters bearing the invisible mark of those who had once walked its paths. And in the hush that followed their final breath, there remained the most enduring legacy of all, the stillness of men who had learned, at last, to be at peace.